Recording our weather briefing this week. So thank you all for coming out. I will just remind everyone that they can use the Q&A function or the chat if they have any questions or comments for our speaker this week. So our speaker this week is DePodwin, a meteorologist at AccuWeather. So thank you so much for volunteering your time to give the briefing this week, and I'll just let you go ahead and get started by sharing your screen.
Great. Always a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen here. Hope everyone's having a good start of the week. Bit of a gloomy day outside, but I guess it finally feels like fall, which is good. So you should be all able to see I have just a really brief PowerPoint here with a couple of notes on Hurricane Delta. We'll start with that, but those who don't know me, Dan DePodwin, I'm the manager of forecast operations at AccuWeather. Been there, I guess it's closing in on 10 years next year. Hard to believe that. If you ever want to get in contact with me, there's my email and my Twitter handle. So I guess actually to start, instead of starting with text, I will start with a video instead. So I'll go to this screen instead. And so here's the comparison of Laura and Delta, which obviously Laura made landfall back in August and Delta made landfall just on Friday. And it's not too often you have two systems make landfall basically on the same spot. In this case, it was 12 miles from each other. Delta was 12 miles east of where Laura made landfall back in October. Obviously, Laura was a major hurricane. I think it was a Category 4 at the time of landfall. Delta was a Category 2, I believe. So slightly weaker, but nonetheless, not what you want ever, and especially twice in the same season, basically the same spot, only within 12 miles of each other. And I've done some digging, and I know a lot of other people have done some digging about where, things that have happened that have been like this in the past. The only one I can really find of two hurricanes making landfall in the same spot, basically in the same season, is when Francis and Jean made landfall within 3 weeks of each other along the east coast of Florida back in, I think it was 04, either 02 or 04. And they basically were in the identical spot. I think it was in the same decimal or the same tenth of a degree of latitude. So very uncommon for a storm to hit basically the same part of coastline in the same season. A couple of other interesting statistics on Delta. If I share my PowerPoint here again, switch here to this. And I thought some of this was interesting, sort of by the numbers with Delta. Some of you may have seen these already, but I thought these were interesting. There's been 10 named storms to make landfall in the CONUS this year. That breaks the single season record, which we currently had, and it was shared by 1916 and 2020 of 9. Now we're at 10. 4 named storms made landfall in Louisiana now in a single season, ties 02 with when Bertha, Hannah, Isidore, and Lily made landfall in Louisiana. Since 1964, I think there's some interesting climatology here. I know when we were thinking about what the track would be for Delta and what the intensity would be for Delta, we were thinking about what's happened in the past in Louisiana in October. There's only been 4 hurricanes to make landfall since 1964 along the Louisiana coast in October: Lily, Juan, Hilda, and now Delta. So there were only 3 before last week. And we were thinking about whether it would be a major hurricane, what the chances are of that. We've had situations where we've had a lot of strengthening before landfall this year, and in previous years, think about Michael from a couple of years ago, which rapidly strengthened, but that was further east on the Gulf Coast before landfall. But the interesting thing about the climatology of the western Gulf Coast or the central Gulf Coast is that there's only been 2 major hurricanes to make landfall along the Louisiana coast in the month of October. And system in 1893, another one in 1886. So very unlikely from just a climatological standpoint to see a major hurricane make landfall in this part of the coast in this month of the year. Most of the climatology in October starts to shift towards the eastern Gulf, Florida, with storms recurving, which we'll talk a bit about towards the end of this briefing because there might be a window for that to happen maybe late next week. Delta was the first hurricane with a Greek letter to make landfall in the U.S. tropical storm Beta made landfall earlier this year. I believe that was the first Greek storm to make landfall, with Delta being the first Greek hurricane, Greek letter hurricane. Strongest hurricane with the Greek letter in the Atlantic Basin on record, with 145-mile-an-hour winds prior to it weakening before it hit the Yucatan last week. And it's also the fastest storm on record to intensify from a depression to a Category 4 just in 30 hours. And we already talked about how it was just east of where Laura made landfall. That second to last bullet point, about 30 hours, is quite a stat. And I'll switch again to my browser here. And here's the loop of the strengthening Delta from depression to Category 4 prior to it weakening before it hit the Yucatan last week. You can see it was a really compact storm too, and got really wound up quickly. It sort of reminded us of what Wilma did back in, I think it was 05, and didn't get to a Category 5, thank goodness. And just as quickly as it spun up, really, it sort of fell apart, so to speak, before it hit the Yucatan. It, it just sort of pulsed quickly and then weakened, and then again slowly strengthened the Gulf and weakened again before landfall in the U.S. So could have been worse in both places for the Yucatan and for the U.S. Obviously bad enough in both, especially the Louisiana coast, which was already trying to recover from Laura, and with tarps on roofs, that doesn't hold up well to a hurricane landfall. With debris piles, there's obviously major issues that will linger for a long time in the Louisiana Gulf Coast area there. So I think that's all I had on Delta and where we were last week with that storm making landfall. I guess any questions or comments before moving on to the weather today and for the rest of the week? All right, so I'll start first with sort of where we were yesterday, the good old EUAL max temp chart on the right-hand side here with the, although I'm not even sure this is right anymore. This may not even work. No, it doesn't. No, yes, it does. So this was yesterday here at October ending this morning from the max temp yesterday, and hot in the plains. Unusual to see hundreds this time of year out there. That's not that typical. Pretty mild in a lot of places, even with 80s shooting up into the northern plains yesterday. Overall, pretty mild middle October day in most spots to end the weekend yesterday. And that warmth that sort of snuck up ahead of a front across the northern plains and upper Midwest generated some good thunderstorms. And storm reports from yesterday, decent number with 58 wind reports, 14 hail reports, and some good, it was a good line yesterday that moved through the Omaha area. Haven't really studied what happened in South Carolina closely yesterday. That's interesting as well. Haven't had a chance to look at that, but 3 tornado reports yesterday. Obviously isn't that typical this time of year. So always like to start sort of where we were yesterday. Here we were pretty mild again too, with temperatures in the 60s. And then I still do a map analysis, not necessarily every day, but I did one this morning, so I'll share that here too, to get a sense for where we are this morning. Hopefully Bill's not on the call. If he is, he can tell me later what he thinks. But he is on the call. Excellent. So I expect Bill to give me a full critique on this later. Did this quickly this morning. It's interesting. I do these most mornings now, and you can really see the change of the seasons too as you do these, right? With the typical, you get stronger pressure gradients as we head into the fall, more storm systems and such. I think a couple of interesting things stand out on this. Obviously, a significant front in the plains, which makes, or the, I guess, the Midwest at this point, moving east. And that makes sense given the storms that we saw across the upper Midwest yesterday. Good dew point surge with 50-degree dew points all the way up into Canada there. A good ton of dew points being pulled northward. And then you have a high behind it, and something to, I think this is a good way to get an overview of sort of what the national picture looks like. Quickly, you can see what happened yesterday compared to what happened, compared to what's happening now. And in the case of Texas, for instance, if we were talking about a national discussion, we would know that it's going to be much nicer and more refreshing in the Texas and Southern Plains area today behind the front. So things we can quickly diagnose by looking at yesterday's temps, storm reports, and then today's surface analysis. Cold front, which I didn't put barbs on, in the Pacific Northwest. And then a pretty significant 1032 millibar high, at least, that's centered just off the, just into Atlantic Canada there, just off the map, doing a good job doing some cold air damming and really keeping this cool, damp air mass here in place across Pennsylvania. But it's interesting as you head further north, obviously, as you get further under that high, you get really, you get much drier. Dew points in the 20s up in New Hampshire and Maine this morning. It's below freezing in some spots. I didn't draw a 32-degree line, but it's below freezing up there in Maine. So, as you head further south, a good onshore flow. So it's just a damp, dreary, and even gusty day. Some wind speeds here this morning, 15 knots already along the Jersey coast. And then fairly quiet across the southeast, but again, a front advancing from the west. That's the quick surface analysis, and I'll jump back again to our web browser here. And before I do that, actually, or before I go to the satellite image, a couple of things just to know from yesterday. Again, the record temps across the southern plains. This should loop here again in a second. There it goes. You see that we had records across a lot of Texas yesterday, as you would expect ahead of that front. And then behind the front, much colder, as we talked about this morning, with some 20, even 30-degree temperature drops here. And as the onshore flow has strengthened in the Northeast and New England today, we are much cooler this time today than we were yesterday, when it was a pretty mild morning despite it being cloudy. Sort of had that tropical feel to it yesterday with the clouds and moisture associated with Delta. And now this is sort of this hybrid with leftover moisture from Delta and an onshore flow contributing to the cloudy, cool, wet weather in the Northeast. And as you'd expect, we're well above yesterday's temps, just ahead of the front with a good southerly wind there. As we'd expect, we can clearly see the front on satellite, and behind it with that high centered across the four corners, it's nice and clear and just a beautiful morning in most of the western 2/3 of the country, except for the Northwest, which has a front moving through it as well. A lot of cloud cover in the east. It's sort of a messy pattern here as we've gotten, the stuff left behind from Delta that has sort of merged with an advancing trough. And you can see the result of that high nosing in from Atlantic Canada and off of Nova Scotia, where we're still sunny and quite nice. There's a pretty sharp delineation of the clouds there across southern Vermont and the northern Adirondacks. Another front here, which I put on my surface analysis, off the coast of the Carolinas, moving east, and there's actually an interesting dew point gradient in Florida this morning. It's pretty refreshing across the Panhandle with dew points in the 60s, which is refreshing for them. And further south, dew points are still in the mid to upper 70s across the southern part of the peninsula. So a fairly active pattern for the east here the next day or so, but fairly quiet further west, again, except for the Northwest, which has had some more storm systems, which is good news for the fire threat out there. And I think we've made it finally into the fire season in Washington and Oregon and Idaho and Montana, although that's not the case further south in California. Still some higher cloud tops here with the convection going on in Wisconsin this morning too. And you can tell that we've got a pretty low cloud deck across the east. I'll loop this as well just to see the progression here this morning. Some really cool clouds with the front in Texas. As you can see that headed on south. Looks like some snow showing up on the highest peaks of the Rockies in Colorado and some of the, I think those are the Wasatch in Utah. And again, pretty clear across northern New England here this morning. It's at high build south. So there's a satellite, and as you'd expect under that satellite, or closer to the surface, we've got the convection across Wisconsin and the far eastern part of Minnesota. A pretty good shield of rain in basically from DC all the way up the I-95 corridor just south of Boston. So a very damp, dreary start of the week here. And that's the case really through the night and into the first part of the day tomorrow. It looks like we'll get into that in a minute. No severe weather, it doesn't look like this morning across Wisconsin, just some heavier downpours, maybe some gusty winds with those downpours and some thunder and lightning moving off to the northeast. We're pretty clear elsewhere. That front is further south. It doesn't look like there's got much with it as we saw on satellite, not really much in the way of convection, maybe a maybe a shower down by Houston in that area, but overall looks like a pretty dry frontal passage in that direction. And we're clear across the west with the exception of some showers that are skirting from west to east across the Intermountain West. So that's where we are right now, and we'll do a little quick zoom in here on the northeast. The surface or this, just our surface plot, and you can really see that cold air damming with temps in the 50s across Pennsylvania, low 50s, and we're, as is standard here, even though the wind's out of the east in Pittsburgh, you don't have that upslope component. So 61 and a little sunnier west of the mountains. Pretty chilly in Binghamton, 47, 43 in Monticello, New York, at 49 in Poughkeepsie, and you can really see that. It's a pretty cool, crisp morning as you head further north. So it's a day where if you were talking about the weather in the Northeast, you'd have to be pretty clear about where you're talking about it, because it's damp and dreary, basically from Boston or just south of Boston through DC. But further north, it's a cool, crisp, really nice fall morning in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. Really nice for the end of the leaves and end of the fall foliage out that way. So we'll get into the forecast here. We'll start with the upper air pattern. We'll take it at this evening. And as we'd expect, a pretty potent shortwave at 500 moving across the Great Lakes associated with that, surface low and front. And there's this sort of weak strung out vorticity further east of it here in the mid-Atlantic, sort of helping to contribute to our wet weather. But a pretty zonal flow overall across the nation. Even this trough isn't that amplified across the Great Lakes. So you'd expect obviously that precipitation to continue east of that, downstream of that trough into the morning tomorrow as that pushes further east, and still some bit of a shortwave behind that as well. As we head through the day tomorrow, it lifts northward. Doesn't really dig at all, so we don't expect a strengthening storm system because we see it lifting and not digging. And again, we're very zonal through the day tomorrow across the United States. I think we'll dig into the Northeast first for the next 24 hours, and then we'll go back to the national look for the next week plus. I guess before I do that, any comments or questions so far? All right. So the Northeast in particular, I just pulled up the HRRR just to get a sense for how this day might progress. And you got to be careful with the HRRR and any type of short range model. Just because it shows something, it may look pretty, but just because it doesn't mean it's valid, obviously. And the good news is it seems to be picking up on the current precip shield decently well. Obviously, we'd expect a pretty damp day given the synoptic setup across the east. Pretty damp. You can see the reflectivity continues to show light, showery, drizzly conditions all the way from DC to southern New England through the day, and the advancing front here appearing on the left-hand side of the screen this afternoon across Indiana and moving into Ohio by nightfall. As we'd expect, the temps don't do much today with that strong east or northeast wind bringing the cooler water off the ocean and just cool and damp. And west of us, as is standard with a cold air dynamic situation, a nice balmy mid-October day in the 70s in parts of the Ohio Valley. So, and then again, here's the wind today. And I think, not to get lost in this, some cold air dynamic situations and some setups like this, you don't get much wind. This is a pretty breezy day. Even stepping outside this morning, it's a cool, breezy day in Pennsylvania. And if you're on the coast today, along the Jersey coast, you can see the HRRR depicting some wind gusts near 30, 35 knots here this afternoon. It looks like this low tries to develop off the Jersey coast later today. It's not Delta, but it's sort of associated with what was left with Delta and move off to the northeast ahead of that trough. And that can really strengthen the onshore flow and bring a real gusty, damp day to the Jersey shore and points north and east through the night tonight. This is still, again, the wind gusts through tonight, according to the HRRR. And so just a blustery day. Going back to the surface analysis, we haven't looked at that yet, but here's this evening. Again, you sort of have this developing low, pretty weak, but again, it's enough to strengthen the onshore flow. and to give us breezy conditions, or more than breezy conditions, along the Jersey coast. That moves off to the north and east tonight. Something we should probably consider, looking at the New York City area tonight. Looks like there's another surge of moisture. You're sort of having this battle zone right now between the dry air trying to push in from the strong high to the northeast and the moisture being pulled northward. It looks like the dry air may try to win out a bit this afternoon. Sort of get some good nosing of the isobars later this evening. But then again, as this low gets going and moves off to the northeast, tonight you get some more divergence aloft ahead of the 500 millibar trough. And looks like you get a bit of a moisture surge. Do I have the PWatts on here? I didn't pull up PWatts, but you probably get a bit of a precipitable water surge north into the Hudson Valley in southern New England by tomorrow morning. That's at least what the models are depicting by tomorrow morning, as that low sort of strengthens, which makes sense. You've got the advancing trough, and so that seems to make sense from a synoptic standpoint. So certainly generally a wet time period from basically southern New England on south and east, and then including the Ohio Valley as the front moves further east here tonight into tomorrow morning. So by the time we get to tomorrow, with that zonal flow, these systems are moving along. They're not waiting around, and by here's tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and we've got the trough moving east, and at the surface we've got this low trying to get going off of Nantucket. And again, a very windy day in coastal New England tomorrow, probably more so than today. Tomorrow is the worst day in New England. Today is the worst day in the mid-Atlantic. And we dry out really quickly. It actually probably turns pretty nice. Surface ridging going on behind the front, and aloft we've got, again, that zonal flow. I don't have my relative humidity in the mid-levels, which I could bring up here, but it probably clears out. It probably dries out a bit, I would think, behind this system. But it probably turns into a pretty nice day in the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley. Here's our max temp forecast for tomorrow, again in the 60s. So pretty nice day behind the system as it departs. And again, we're pretty dry in the mid-levels by tomorrow evening. So looks like things clear out nicely through the second half of the day. So for Wednesday here, again, we're moving systems along very quickly. In Northwest, we've got a pretty wet day tomorrow as this next system in this train of systems moves into the Northwest. It was pretty wet there yesterday as well, which again is good news to end the fire threat and the fire season in Washington and Oregon. This will bring some mountain snow. I haven't looked at the snow levels, but I would imagine it looks pretty mild, so probably mostly above pass level out in the Northwest. And I think the main story with this probably is the wind. Do I have wind gusts? Yeah, I do. So here are the 10-meter wind gusts valid tomorrow afternoon. Not overly gusty, but enough to be on the windier side as this storm moves onshore. By Wednesday, that wind threat sort of moves into the southern Wyoming area, which can be a pretty notorious area there for wind gusts 70 plus as you head just west of Cheyenne. And then, so that's by Wednesday. So pretty windy as you'd expect in the wake of that system. And we're moving along quickly. That shortwave sort of tries to dig, and we get this pretty, it's pretty wide trough centered across Missouri by Thursday afternoon. And this sort of sets up what may happen later in the week in our area. I think between later, like the second half of the day tomorrow and Thursday, we're dry and nice. High pressure builds in. Looks like a really nice day Wednesday with the high centered off to our south. And then Thursday, again, we're prefrontal, so we're probably turning milder Thursday. So overall, a nice middle part of the week. We'll be watching this approaching and deepening storm that again moves into the west tomorrow. And you can see the surface low really get going by Wednesday morning across the Dakotas down to about 998 on the European. And that makes sense here. We've got a pretty good bunch of vorticity here, moving from west to east. By Thursday morning, 994 north of the Great Lakes, and a pretty good cold front extending further south, ushering in pretty chilly air, some of the coldest air of the season behind it. So our next thing to worry about is what happens here later in the week. And as one would expect, the models have a variety of ideas about what that might be. So I'll go ahead to Friday. And here's the 500 millibar prog from the European on Friday and from the GFS. Really similar. A little deeper trough, a little more amplified in the European, which makes sense, or which sort of shows up well in the resultant surface prog from both models. So here's the European, again, pretty amplified, and here's the GFS a little less so. And then at the surface, the European has more moisture being drawn northward, and a pretty heavy rain event across the mid-Atlantic and Northeast on Friday, whereas the GFS is a little less organized and more scattered in terms of its precipitation. The main theme here is that there is at least a moderate chance for a rain event Friday. Whether it's at this point, it looks like it's east of here. But with the front here, we probably get some type of precipitation with the passage of it Thursday night. So that's the thing I think we should watch out for as we head into the next, couple days, is what this looks like by the end of the week. The Euro continues to dig this trough by Saturday morning and tilted negative, and you can really see the results of that, and it turns into a significant coastal low, blasting New England with a whole bunch of rain, which would be good news in some ways because they're still in a drought in that area. But GFS, on the other hand, is much more progressive and moves it off to the east quicker, and brings a pretty cool day to the northeast behind it to start the weekend. I think one of the things that stands out to me here is that there's a decent likelihood of some places getting their first snowflakes of the season here across the interior northeast and the higher elevations. Doesn't seem to be much in the way of accumulation that would be expected, but there's cold enough air behind this system with 850s, not just below zero, but decently below zero, that we may be able to get some wet snowflakes to mix in at some of the higher elevations by Saturday, even if it's just on some northwest flow precipitation. So that covers through the week here, and the rest of the country is pretty quiet. It's a pretty zonal pattern. So all the active weather is across the northern tier of the nation, and it's been very dry and just fairly warm too across the southern half of the country. There's still a fire threat in the southwest and Southern California. Fortunately, this week it looks like the pattern doesn't really lend itself to a significant Santa Ana or any other type of wind events. There will be some breezy conditions, but it doesn't look overly windy, which is good news. But they've got a long way to go in their fire season in Southern California, and it's already been a record-setting season in California with over, I think it's 4 million acres burned, and that is that blows the old record of 1.9 million acres out of the water. So, and that's all basically been in Northern California, not all, but most of it's been in Northern California. So we'll see how the next couple months evolve, but this time of the year is the peak season really for Southern California as we head into October and November with Santa Ana events before the active Pacific jet drops that far south, and we try to get some moisture in that way. So I guess any question on that? I did want to talk briefly about the tropics and some of the long range thoughts for the last couple of minutes, but happy to take any questions or thoughts. I see Kevin message sent here in the chat, very progressive flow, big time zonal Pacific jet surging so far. And that's a great point. That's a really good point. If we're in the zonal flow in January, we're not going to be looking at snow chances in this area, that's for sure. We'll see if we can get some more blocking, unlike we had last winter. So briefly in the long range, I guess just to look at some ensemble guidance too to start. So here's the Friday from the European ensemble. Friday, or I guess we'll look at Saturday morning. You see a whole host of surface lows being progged anywhere from Atlantic City up towards Caribou, Maine, showing the idea of a surface low developing ahead of that trough. How deep it is, who really knows? But most of these lows are right around 1,000 or just below 1,000 millibars, so it doesn't look overly deep, but enough to cause some problems for the beginning of the weekend in New England. And here's the reflection of the ensemble mean precipitation from the European ensemble. Pretty good signal of at least some steady precipitation overnight into Saturday morning. So that seems like a good forecast for now to have, the idea of rain, from basically here on east Friday night. I always like to look at this too. This is the percent chance of less than 32 degrees to see any type of freezes they may go on this, in this area. This is just an instantaneous, like it's not a minimum temp of the last 6 hours. It's just the current temp chance that it's below freezing. And we don't really see much sneak into Pennsylvania until after that frontal passage late in the week, which one would expect. And looks like a pretty good chance of a freeze by the 17th and 18th. And it may continue to have that chance for nighttime lows in the 30s as we head into next week. Beyond that, this is the 5-day average 500 millibar anomaly and heights. So here's the 5 days ending next Wednesday. So that's basically this coming weekend through next Wednesday. And we still see sort of this mean trough setting up to our west across the plains in the upper Midwest. But overall, still pretty zonal. As my cat hops onto my chair. Hold on, let me move him so he doesn't bother. Hey. Thanks. That's fairly standard every day usually. And it's right around this time. Figured that would happen. So we've got this, fairly zonal but a mean trough across the center of the nation. And this continues, at least according to the European ensemble, through, here's the 5 days ending on Saturday the 24th. A little bit of higher anomalies in the east, still again, lower anomalies across the plains. And that's reflected too in the 2-meter temp forecast with cooler than normal temps across the, the northern Rockies, northern plains, and warmer than normal in the east. And for any snow lovers, as one would expect in October, there's basically no chance for snow here. Here's the European accumulated snow through the entire period, the ensemble mean, and not much expected, although there's probably some chances in the northern Rockies coming up here as well. And the last thing I wanted to mention is the tropics. I'll just pull up the NHC briefly. I mean, this wouldn't be complete without talking about what the next storm is, and I forget what we're up to next. We're probably, is it E? Well, it's not always in order with the Greek alphabet, but this disturbance here east of the Antilles probably doesn't do much. There's a lot of shear across the Atlantic basin, some dry air out in this area as well. It's going to move towards the islands. The hurricane center has a 30% chance on it. It seems like the higher likelihood for this system to develop would be next week as it heads into the central and western Caribbean. I hesitate to bring up long-range deterministic models, but I think it's sort of instructive with what could happen, not what is going to happen. But here's the GFS. This is the 0Z GFS from earlier this morning for the Sunday the 25th, and you can see the idea with a significant tropical system over Cuba. And this was the 18Z GFS from yesterday, again with a similar idea. The idea isn't to take this verbatim at all. The idea is to show that there's the potential for some type of tropical feature in the Western Caribbean later next week, which makes sense too if you think about it with the upper air pattern. And this is sort of how this time of year works, where you've got troughs digging into the eastern part of the country. Sometimes you have surface highs further off to the south across the southeast, and you can get some good cyclonic flow going on in the Caribbean. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, the climatology for this time of year for tropical system tracks is in the eastern Gulf. And that's because you have much more in the way of digging troughs and fronts helping to turn off the, turn these systems off to the northeast. And there's been a lot of significant hurricane landfalls in the west coast of Florida in October. So this is the time of year to watch out for that part of the country. And it certainly seems like that possibility is open this year. It doesn't look like we're shut off in terms of development. So the next threat to the U.S. potentially would be, I think, probably the middle or later part of next week. Obviously, a long way to go, and the system would have to, survive into the Caribbean. So, and I see Rich has a 60 GFS as a storm too. Not so good in the GEFs, but the GFS looks fun. But yeah, it's certainly a low probability. Way too far between now and a Saturday from now, almost 2 weeks to to really pin down anything, but just something to be thinking about and looking at as we head through the next few days this week and see how this evolves. So I think I'll leave it at that and be happy to take any final thoughts or questions about the weather, observations about the hurricane season, and so on. Yeah, should be some good fall foliage still, although we may lose a little bit. I don't think it's too windy behind the front tomorrow, but I know places in northern New England are already past peak, but here it looks really good. So well, thanks everybody. Always good to chat, and hope everyone has a good rest of the week and a good rest of the semester.
Perfect. Thank you everybody for attending today, and I hope to see you all next week with our speaker, John Bangoff from the National Weather Service State College. So have a good rest of your week, and hopefully this was a nice start to it.